We are crushed to the ground. We lie in ruins. Nothing but grief and suffering. That's from an Aztec poem written right around 1521.
Yeah, just after the Spanish arrived in Mexico.
Yeah.
Well, it's just a devastating way to capture that moment in time.
Absolutely. And it really grounds us in the human side of what we're diving into today,
Right.
the Columbian Exchange.
Exactly. Our mission here is to explore how that connection, first established by Christopher Columbus, just fundamentally reset global history. We'll look at the causes, some surprising economic ripples, and the huge lasting effects on both sides of the Atlantic.
It's amazing to think, for thousands of years, these two massive hemispheres were basically completely separate worlds.
Almost entirely isolated, yeah. And then suddenly, boom, they're connected. And this created a whole new way of life, really a synthesis of indigenous American, European, and crucially African traditions.
And the effects weren't just, populations and plants and animals. They went deep into the global economy right away.
Oh, immediately. And one of the most fascinating early effects our sources point to is this sort of economic boomerang. Take Spain, for instance. They mined incredible amounts of silver in the Americas.
Right. Unimaginable wealth. That was the dream, wasn't it?
That was absolutely the dream. But here's the twist. That massive influx of silver, it triggered runaway inflation back in Spain.
Wait, so the very wealth they were chasing actually helped destabilize their own empire.
Precisely. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. Instead of securing Spain's dominance, the silver boom kind of threw their domestic economy into chaos and, contributed to the empire's eventual decline.
Wow. That just shows how interconnected everything became almost overnight.
It really does.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole exchange. And I think we have to start with the heaviest part, the most destructive element, disease.
Agreed. Before we get to the crops and the horses and everything else, you have to grasp the sheer scale of the population catastrophe. It really sets the stage for everything that followed.
Because the biological reality was stark, right?
Wow.
Isolation meant no immunity.
Exactly. Millennia of separation meant the indigenous peoples of the Americas had absolutely zero prior exposure and therefore no built-up defenses against the germs that had been swirling around Afro-Eurasia for centuries.
And our sources are really clear on this point. It wasn't mainly the European weapons, the guns, the horses, the steel swords that conquered the Americas?
No, not primarily. The real conqueror, the primary killer, was disease. Invisible microbes.
How did that happen so fast? How did this invisible enemy become such a devastating advantage?
It was just lethal exposure. Europeans carried diseases like smallpox, which, spreads through breathing, incredibly contagious measles, influenza. They might have had some immunity from generations of it, but when they encountered populations with none.
Catastrophe.
Utter catastrophe. Conquistadors like Pizarro and Cortez, they weren't just soldiers. They were walking vectors for illnesses that could wipe out entire communities, sometimes faster than any army could.
And it wasn't only the soldiers, right? The colonists settling down brought things with them, too.
Oh, absolutely. They brought rats, insects carrying diseases, plus the ongoing exposure to measles, flu, and even malaria took a terrible toll.
The numbers are just hard to comprehend.
They really are horrifying. The sources suggest the indigenous population across the Americas dropped by more than 50% in less than a century, just from disease alone.
More than half.
And in some areas, it was far worse. Some lands lost up to 90% of their original population. 90%.
90%.
Yeah.
That's one of the greatest population disasters in all of human history. It's not just a decline. It's almost an erasure in some places.
It fundamentally reshaped the continents.
Mm-hmm.
And that vacuum, that devastation, directly created the need for labor and the availability of land that then drove the next phase of the exchange.
Right. Which brings us to the second major element. This huge biological swap, plants and animals going back and forth.
Yeah, let's look first at what went from east to west, the things introduced to the Americas.
Okay, so Europeans basically brought their entire farmyard with them.
Pretty much. Oxen for plowing, pigs, cattle, sheep, goats, chickens, all new to the Americas.
And the impact on food alone was revolutionary.
Completely transformative. Think about it. Before the 1500s, people in Mesoamerica ate very little meat. Now, fast forward to today, and Mexican food, for example, relies so heavily on pork, beef, cheese, all things unknown there before the exchange.
And then there's the horse. that one animal,
Oh, the horse! It utterly changed life for the Plains Indians. Suddenly, hunting buffalo became incredibly efficient.
which gave them a food surplus, freeing up time for other things.
Exactly. More time for art, for spiritual life, for developing complex societies. But there was a downside, too.
Right, increased competition.
Yeah, that efficiency also fueled more competition and conflict between tribes. Access to horses became a major factor in power dynamics and, who controlled the best hunting grounds.
Okay, so animals and crops going west, wheat, grapes, sugar, oranges, coffee.
Lettuce, barley, okra, rice. The list goes on. But the flow from west to east, the gifts from the Americas back to Afro-Eurasia, arguably had an even bigger impact on global population.
This is where we get things like corn, potatoes, tomatoes.
Maize, yes, potatoes, tomatoes, beans, peppers, cacao, the source of chocolate, manioc, tobacco, peanuts, these incredibly nutritious, calorie-packed crops.
The potato is such a great example. We think of it as Irish or Russian, but it's purely American in origin.
Absolutely. And the introduction of these foods, especially potatoes and maize, fueled tremendous population growth back in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Simply put, people had access to more calories and better nutrition.
It literally fed the expansion of Europe.
In a very real way, yes. And we shouldn't forget the animals that went east, like turkeys, llamas, alpacas, guinea pigs, or the non-food items.
Like rubber.
Rubber, yeah, first used as an eraser, believe it or not.
Yeah.
And maybe even more importantly, quinine.
Ah, the malaria treatment.
Exactly. Derived from the bark of a South American tree, it was the first effective treatment for malaria, which had a massive impact on global health, especially in tropical zones.
So we've got this demographic collapse in the Americas and simultaneously this dietary revolution boosting populations elsewhere. It seems like these two things inevitably lead to the third piece.
They do. They lead directly to the engine of empire. Cash crops and the forced migration of people.
Spain started with silver, but pretty soon the European powers figured out where the really big sustainable money was.
That's right. Plantation agriculture. Cash crops, things grown purely for sale on the market, not for the farmer to eat, things like sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee. They eventually eclipsed even silver as the main moneymakers.
And sugar was king, right?
Yeah.
Especially for the Portuguese in Brazil.
Sugar was absolute king. Brazil's climate was perfect for sugarcane, but this created a huge problem.
Labor.
A massive labor problem. Remember, European diseases had already wiped out vast numbers of the indigenous population.
And those who were forced into labor often escaped, I imagine. Brazil's huge.
Exactly. Many escaped into the jungle interior. So, facing this severe labor shortage in an incredibly profitable industry, the Portuguese turned to the transatlantic slave trade.
Importing enslaved people from Africa.
Yes, primarily from regions like the Congo Kingdom and the Swahili Coast in East Africa. And the sheer profitability of sugar just dramatically scaled up the capture, sale, and forced transportation of Africans.
The numbers involved in the Atlantic system are just horrific.
They are. And the distribution is key. Over 90% of all enslaved Africans were taken to the Caribbean and South America, mostly for sugar plantations.
Only about 6% to what became the U.S.
Roughly, yes, British North America received a relatively small percentage. It's a stark reminder that until the mid-1800s, far more Africans than Europeans crossed the Atlantic to the Americas.
To the point where African laborers and their descendants became the majority in places like Brazil.
That's correct.
And these sugar plantations, they were called engenhos.
Yes, engenhos, the Portuguese word for engines,
Mm-hmm.
which tells you how central they were to the whole colonial economy. They were brutal, industrialized processing centers.
And the conditions for the enslaved people working them.
Just horrific. The work was relentless, nutrition was poor, disease was rampant. Plantation owners literally factored in losing 5 to 10% of their enslaved workforce every year due to death.
5 to 10% annually. It was a system that constantly consumed human lives and demanded constant replacement through the slave trade.
A brutal, brutal system.
Which leads to this really disturbing irony you find in the sources. Even as millions of Africans were being kidnapped and shipped across the ocean.
The overall population in Africa itself was actually growing during the 16th and 17th centuries.
How is that possible?
It's another complex biological twist. Africa benefited from those very same nutritious American crops we talked about earlier, particularly yams and manioc, which came back from Brazil.
Ah, so the calorie boost from American crops helped offset or even overcome the population loss from the slave trade back in Africa.
It seems so. These crops were integrated into African agriculture, improved nutrition, boosted resilience, and supported population growth, even amidst the horrors of the slave trade. It's a really difficult paradox.
Wow, okay, so despite the absolute horror of the Middle Passage and enslavement, the African diaspora,
Yeah.
the forced dispersion enslaved Africans in the Americas managed to retain and adapt crucial parts of their cultures.
Yes, and this is so important. Their cultural resilience profoundly shaped the societies that developed throughout the Americas.
What were some of the key ways they did this? Language must have been a huge challenge.
A massive challenge. Enslavers often deliberately mixed people from different linguistic groups to make communication harder.
Right, to prevent organizing or rebellion.
Exactly. So most Africans lost their specific native languages after a generation or so, but they didn't just adopt the colonizers' languages wholesale, they were incredibly creative.
They blended them.
Yes, they combined elements of English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, whatever the colonial language was, with West African grammatical patterns and structures. This created entirely new languages, Creole languages.
And those are still spoken widely today.
Oh, yes, especially in the Caribbean, where the concentration of enslaved Africans was highest. Creole languages dominate there. In the U.S., the main example is the Gula or Geechee language, spoken along the coast of South Carolina and Georgia.
Because that region also had a very high density of enslaved people.
Extremely high, yeah. Slaves once made up about 75% of the population in that coastal area.
And beyond language, music was obviously vital.
Absolutely critical, not just for cultural expression, but for survival. The syncopated rhythms, the call and response patterns, the use of percussion, these African musical elements survived.
And formed the basis for so much later music.
Everything. Gospel, blues, jazz, rock and roll, samba in Brazil, reggae in the Caribbean, even elements of country music. Music was used to endure the brutal workday, to maintain community, and sometimes even as a coded way to communicate.
Like planning escapes.
Exactly. They also blended European Christian hymns with their own religious music to create Negro spirituals. And, importantly, they invented the banjo.
The banjo is an African-American invention.
Yes, derived from similar stringed instruments common across West Africa.
Yeah.
It's a distinctly American instrument with African roots.
And food, too. Right. We can't forget the culinary contributions.
Definitely not. Africans brought their knowledge of how to grow and cook certain crops that became staples. Think about rice cultivation in the Carolinas, or okra.
Okra, leading to gumbo.
Precisely. Dishes like gumbo are a direct result of blending African ingredients and cooking techniques with local ones. It's a cornerstone of southern U.S. cuisine today.
Okay, so we've covered disease, the bioswap, the forced labor system, and cultural adaptation. What about the environmental impact of all this?
That's the other big piece. European approaches to land use were fundamentally different and much more intensive than many indigenous practices.
How so?
Well, Europeans arrived with the mindset of clearing land on a large scale for agriculture. They cut down vast forests to create fields for crops like wheat or sugar, often planting the same crop year after year.
And brought grazing animals.
And brought large numbers of grazing animals, cattle, sheep, goats, which hadn't existed in the Americas before.
So the consequences were?
Pretty severe and widespread. Deforestation on a massive scale. Soil depletion from monoculture farming. Overgrazing by livestock, which led to significant soil erosion.
And more concentrated settlements meant more strain, too.
Right. Denser European-style towns and settlements put more pressure on local water supplies and created more concentrated areas of waste and pollution compared to many more dispersed indigenous settlement patterns.
So if we're drawing up a sort of final balance sheet for the exchange, what are the key things flowing each way?
Okay, broadly speaking, from east to west, you get things like alphabetic writing, firearms, new farming techniques, but also the devastating diseases, the concept of chattel slavery based on race, and new social hierarchies.
And from west to east?
You get the revolutionary food crops, potatoes, maize, tomatoes that fuel population booms. You get vital medicines like quinine, industrial materials like rubber, animals like turkeys, and tobacco.
Right. Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up. The Columbian Exchange is this incredibly complex story. It's an unprecedented demographic catastrophe for one hemisphere.
Mixed with this profound global dietary expansion that literally changed what people ate everywhere and fueled population growth elsewhere.
And the whole thing driven by this tragic, brutal engine of forced labor.
Which ultimately resulted in the incredible racial and ethnic diversity we see across the Americas today. It's a legacy of collision, tragedy, and adaptation.
It leaves us with a really challenging thought, doesn't it?
It really does.
That final irony you mentioned earlier. Think about it. The very crops from the Americas, like potatoes and manioc, were boosting populations and improving nutrition in Europe and Africa.
At the exact same time that European actions and diseases were causing the single greatest population collapse in human history back in the Americas.
What does it even mean when one hemisphere's biological gifts end up fueling the very engine that's exploiting it?
That's the question, isn't it? A deep, unsettling question about how interconnected and often tragically ironic history can be. Something for all of us to think about.